It's less than 2 weeks out from a convention, so let's make a costume. Hello and welcome back to yet another video. I don't know if you can tell from my amazing hairstyle that looks really cool. Please validate me below. I'm doing a Star Wars costume this week. Yay! As of today, it is 2 weeks out from my next convention, which is Auckland Armageddon Winter Edition, and I decided to make a Star Wars costume. I have a Rey lightsaber slash Anakin lightsaber slash Luke Skywalker lightsaber sitting around, so I thought, why not do something with that and make a Rey costume to go with it. That way I don't have to wear a wig, because at the moment I hate wearing wigs, and I can just use my own hair and it'll be great. It's also potentially a quick costume that I could smash out in under 2 weeks. This series will be split over 2 videos. This week I will be tackling the main portions of the costume, so shirt, pants, the sash thing, and next week I will be doing the accessories, so like arm wraps, belt, bag, and shoes, because oh lordy, I hate myself, I want to make a pair of shoes. With all that being said, let's get on into making parts of this costume. Let me introduce you to my fabrics. First, for the sash, I have this cheesecloth, which as you can see right now is a pristine white, but I'll deal to that later once I've turned it into one long continuous piece of fabric. I will dirty it up and we'll get it looking nice and scavengery. Yes, that's the word. Next is a 100% greyish beige linen, which is for the pants. And finally, for the shirt, I have a white jersey knit fabric, and once again, too white, but we will get round to that later. Probably going to tea stain it. Yeah, shirt fabric. Let's get started. First things first, I'm starting with the pants. For the pattern, I'll be using McCall's M8057. And the only thing it requires, other than the fabric, is elastic. On to the first part of any project, which of course is cutting out the pattern pieces. Once all the pattern pieces are cut out, I then make sure to transfer any of the notches and markings. Once that's done, I can start assembling the pants, so I sew the front and back pieces together along the inner leg seam just here. Now, as you may have noticed, I've actually pre-overlocked all of the edges of the pants, and that's just because this fabric was fraying like crazy. Next, I sew these 2 pieces together along the U shape here. Next, it's time to add pockets. Now, I did actually debate whether or not to add pockets to this, and then I thought, stuff it, I like having pockets in my clothes, and she's a scavenger. Surely she'll have extra pockets too, so this costume gets pockets. Once the pockets are sewn into the side seam, I then iron them back, making them nice and flat. Next, the front and back pieces get sewn together along the side, and thus creating pockets. After both of the pockets are sewn, it's time to tackle the waistband. So you fold it along the fold line there, and then I'm just going to sew along the guides that I drew earlier, and this creates channels where I'm going to insert elastic later. Pants are pants. So all I need to do now is obviously put some elastic through the waistband, and then they're mostly done. Well, they're done according to the pattern. The next thing I'll have to do after that is add some cuffs to the bottom. But yeah, let's cut some elastic. I know I just said I was going to cut some elastic, but I forgot to film that part, so instead here's me making the cuffs. So the first thing I did was using this pattern as a base, and then I extended it so that it was the length of the width of my calf where I want the pants to sit. I then added some seam allowance and then cut it out, and then moved on to cutting 2 long bias strips, which I will sandwich in between the cuff, you'll see shortly. With the strips completely cut out, it's back to the cuffs, so I iron over a seam allowance along one edge and then fold it along the fold line and then iron that in place. Next, I prepare it for sewing. So I take those 2 bias strips that I cut, and I've actually put them in the wrong way here. They go in so that the length is on the inside, and then I fold it in half and sew it along this edge. Then I run a gathering stitch along the bottom edge of the pants. I pull the stitches by hand until I'm happy with how it's sitting. Then I pin the cuff inside the pants and it gets sewn in place. Then I fold it along the fold line that I made earlier and begin hand stitching the inside of the cuff. Alright, now that the pants are done, let us move on to making the shirt. For the base pattern, I'm using Simplicity S9455. First things first, it's time to cut out the pattern pieces. Once all the pieces are cut out, it is then time to sew the front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams. Okay, so before I get started on sewing the shirt pieces together, I just wanted to share with you guys something I discovered while doing the research for this, and that is how the seams are put together. So if you look closely at the seams that run on the shoulders and down the side of the shirt, you'll notice that they appear, well, like they haven't been sewn together by a machine. They're quite smooth and they've got one raw edge along the outside. So what I'm thinking is, let me share with you how I think I'm going to tackle these seams. Using a bit of invisible hem tape, I've marked out the seam allowance in the shoulder seam here, and I sandwich it in between the two layers of the fabric and then iron it together. The hem tape acts as a glue and bonds the two pieces of fabric together. But of course Ray also has some tiny little hand stitching details on there, so I add those in as well. With the shoulder seams finished, I can then move on to the neckline. So I sew a strip around the edge, and I can actually do this via machine because you don't see this edge on the finished product because the strip gets folded over on top of itself. And then I finish that by hand, and yeah, it encases that stitch. So yay, I get to use the machine for a bit. Here I'm trimming back the seam allowance so that it's only 1 centimeter thick. Next I begin folding and pinning the neck strip in place, and then it gets finished by hand. Once that's all done, I move on to the front plackets. I sew 2 strips to either side of the V. I'm sorry that I forgot to film the rest of the sewing of the placket in. It just got really confusing and fiddly, and so I had to pour all of my concentration into it. But as you can see here, we have a nice little welt, opens up to about there, hand stitched down on the inside and hand stitched at the front part there. So now I'm ready to join the two sides together. And just like I did with the shoulder seams before, I mark out the seam allowance and then cut some invisible hen tape to fit. I then place the tape within that seam allowance and very carefully drape the other side of the shirt over and iron it down in place. Once both sides are done, I then move on to adding those tiny little hand stitching details again. Once all the tiny stitches are done, it's on to the sleeves. So I used the pattern that came with the rest of the shirt as a base, and then I drew a series of lines which I then cut through. I then sewed all of the strips together with a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance, making sure that the raw edges of the seam are on the outside of the sleeve. Then I fold the sleeve in half and sew this seam here. And finally I pin it to the shirt and sew it all in place. Hello, nighttime poorly lit version of me checking in to let you know I was doing some research on Ray for her bag, which I'll be starting tomorrow, and I came across this photo, which completely changes how I would have done the sleeves. So I'm going to redo the sleeves because, as you can see, only one of the sleeves has the weird striping bit on it and the other one is smooth, and they're also cap sleeves, not full sleeves like what I've done. So I'll just remake those right now. Obviously the first thing I had to do was unpick the sleeves that I just made so nicely the day before. This time I'm using the same cap sleeve pattern that I used for my Sailor Jupiter costume, so I cut one out of just the normal fabric.
And then I prepare the fabric for the second sleeve. So to do this, I cut a series of 2.5 centimeter wide strips and then sewed them together with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, making sure that the wrong sides were together. Then I cut the second sleeve out of a combination of the plain fabric and the stripped fabric that we just made. I made sure that the fold line was along the halfway point where the two pieces of fabric met. Then for both of the sleeves, I fold them in half and add a basting stitch along here. I do this via machine because you're not going to see it when it's attached to the shirt. And just like how I did all of the seams on the shirt, I'm attaching the sleeves in the exact same way, and that's with invisible hem tape. This was actually quite tricky to do around this curved shape, but I just went slowly and I got there in the end. Once they were attached, I then finished them off the same way as the other sleeves, and that was with the tiny little hand stitching details. Now that the shirt's done, let's make the shawly wraparound bit. In all honesty, I don't think this piece is that difficult to make at all. Something I did notice though, once again in the researching phase of this, is that it actually has a seam at the halfway point. So that made my life so much easier because it meant I didn't have to buy 5 meters of the fabric. What I've done is I have a 2.5 meter long bit of cheesecloth and I'm literally folding it in half, then cutting it down the middle, and then you have your two pieces. And just like how I did the seams on the shirt, that's exactly how I'm going to do the seam when I join the two lengths together. And just in case you've forgotten how I did that, here's a little refresher. So I have my invisible hem tape and I'm just measuring out a length of that. I cut it and then lay it along one edge of the cheesecloth. Then I lay the other piece of cheesecloth straight on top of it and I iron them together. Ignore the colour change in the fabric here, that'll be explained slightly later in the video, but here I am putting the wrap on my dress form. To keep the wrap from moving around while it's worn, I did a series of gathering stitches where the wrap sits on the shoulder. Once the fabric was all gathered, I then added 2 snaps in the shoulder, one right here and another one at the neckline. Now that everything is done, I think it's time to start weathering it. To weather all the pieces, I'm going to run them through a dye bath in a mixture of these colours. Now I just sort of eyeballed the colour and I did a lot of test strips to make sure it was the colour that I was after. And this is also the only point that you'll see me stirring this, and that's because I want the colours to come through splotchy. So here it is on the line. As you can see, it's nighttime. I think I'm happy with it. Obviously I'm gonna have to wait till it's dry and in the daylight. I love how it's got like splotches of colour through it, and that's just because I didn't stir it while it was dyeing, but it's given it a really nice effect. Yeah, excited to see what this is going to look like in the daylight. Alright, it's now the morning and it's actually raining. Yay. So the fabric's not quite dry, but I think the wraps and the shawl came out a little bit too brown. I'm thinking I'm going to put them through another dye bath just now with a bit more grey in it. Just because, yeah, I think that's a bit too brown. However, the shirt, perfect. Very, very happy with the colour the shirt is. And here we are. Here it is out of the second dye batch. It's a lot more grey beige now, which is kind of what I was after. What do you think, Daisy? She don't care. But yeah, we'll have to see what it looks like when it's completely dry. To add even more weathering, I'm using some soft pastels and a brush, and I'm just dabbing it onto the parts of the costume where I think that, you know, weathering would occur. There's really no rules to this, and it's one of those measure with your heart type things. And once I was feeling it was looking dirty enough, it was time for me to try on everything I've made so far.
So there you have it. That is how I made what I would consider to be the main body parts of the Ray costume. I'm so happy with how they turned out, especially the pieces I had to dye, because there was a moment there where I was so worried that I had ruined everything and that they were all too brown, but I think I managed to salvage it in the end. In next week's video, I will be showing you how to make her accessories like her shoes, belt, bracer, and the arm wraps, because I don't know if you can tell, but they're not done for this video yet. I just put what I had on for effect, just because the costume looked a little bit plain without, you know, the wraps and the belt. So you've got that to look forward to. In the meantime, if you did like what you saw here today, please consider leaving a like and maybe even a comment. And if you really liked it, maybe even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting, and fun related things here on this channel, and I usually try and upload every week or so. With all that being said, I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye!
I forgot how to do it.
So if you...
Cool. We're done. Okay.